Welcome to the Garrulous Gavel. I'm John Tico. My guest in this episode is Christopher Deubert. He goes by Chris. Chris has had a very interesting career as a sports lawyer, and we'll be talking to him about how that career developed, including his time spent at the Football Players Health Study at Harvard University, and then his time as the General Counsel, that's the head lawyer, for the DC United professional soccer team. Chris will also help us unpack some of the more interesting recent intersections of sports and law, including the Major League Baseball lockout and the new collective bargaining agreement, the Brian Flores versus NFL race discrimination lawsuit, and the new name, image, likeness rules that apply to college athletes for the first time just this year. Then we will get garrulous with Chris about one of his other passions, which is reading biographies of American presidents. So far, he's up to president number 32. Do you know which one that was? If you stick around to the end, you'll find out. And you'll also be somewhat surprised to hear which two presidents are Chris's favorites. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Welcome to the Garrulous Gavel. I'm John Tico, and my guest today is Chris Deubert. Hi, Chris. How are you today?
Good. Thanks, John. How are you?
I am doing well. So Chris is an attorney based here in Washington, D.C. at the moment, and he is works in the area of sports law. So we're going to be having an interesting conversation today about what sports lawyers do, how one becomes a sports lawyer. We'll be hearing a little bit about Chris's journey in that world, and then we're going to touch on some of the sort of fun, hot-button issues that have been in the news lately. We'll talk about the Major League Baseball, the new collective bargaining agreement, how that went down, and how that's going to maybe change the business of baseball a little bit. We'll talk about the Brian Flores lawsuit against the NFL, some things that are going on in college sports. And we'll also talk about the intersection of health and bioethics in sports, which is an area that Chris has some experience and particular interest in. And then at the end, stick around for this, but Chris is also an expert in the history of American presidents. And he tells me he has read bios of 32 of the presidents so far. So we're going to be talking to him about that journey, that maybe that's a sport, maybe that's a marathon of biographies, but we'll have a little conversation about that at the end. So let's start where we normally do. We're going to learn a little bit about our guest. Chris, where'd you grow up?
I grew up in New Jersey, about 40 minutes outside New York City.
Okay, and so do you regard yourself as primarily a New Jersey person or as a New York City person?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's one of some import that I learned very early on. I went to University of Massachusetts, and I remember this was when the Yankees and Red Sox in the early 2000s was quite a heated rivalry. And at some orientation, taking flack for being from New Jersey, and I jokingly apologized, and some senior told me don't ever apologize for being from New Jersey, which I later, sort of internalized a little better. So, I strongly identify with New Jersey and New York, but I'm a person of the Northeast and the Northeast corridor. I think at this point.
Well, that way you don't insult anybody if you put it that way.
Right.
But since we're talking about sports, right, we have to. This becomes important in the sports world, right? Because there are teams who are actually based in New Jersey who claim to be New York teams, and this has always bothered me. Now, I grew up on Long Island.
Okay.
Right, and at that time there was an NFL football team called the Jets that was played on Long Island, and they were the New York Jets. As I understand it, they no longer play in New York and haven't for quite a number of years. And this is true of the Giants as well. And yet they still claim to be from New York. So, like, how, as somebody who grew up in New Jersey, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, their situation's not unique. There are a variety of teams throughout the sports world that have monikers that are not necessarily the most accurate. I mean, there was actually a legal case about this. The Los Angeles Angels of Anaheim, the city of Anaheim had given them quite a bit of money to build a stadium in Anaheim, and so they changed their name to the Anaheim Angels, and this is maybe 20, 25 years ago. Anaheim sued them because their agreement had said you have to keep the name Anaheim. The Angels had gotten around that by calling themselves the Los Angeles Angels of Anaheim. They wanted LA included in their name for marketing purposes, and they won an arbitration. They let them. That's why today they're the Los Angeles Angels of Anaheim. I think in New Jersey we feel the opposite. It's slighted, in fact, because both the Giants and Jets at this point have played in the Meadowlands of New Jersey for 50 plus years, and both of their training facilities are New Jersey. I think the Jets have a Manhattan corporate office, but otherwise, the vast majority of their operations are in New Jersey. So New Jersey is getting the short end of the stick, I think.
Right. But they're worried that if they become the New Jersey Jets, that their franchise will somehow lose 2% of its value or something.
Probably
like that,
even
right?
more, yeah. Something like that, yeah.
But you do have the Devils. The Devils are loyal to your state.
We lost the Nets, but yes, the Devils are our last sort of sole team in the state.
So the Nets were the Nets were the New Jersey Nets at one point.
Yeah, their history, they had been the New York Nets in like 50 years ago, and I'm actually not even sure where they played then. They may have moved around a little bit. But yes, then they were the New Jersey Nets for an extended period of time until they became the Brooklyn Nets now, I don't know, 8-10 years ago.
I think when I was a kid, they were playing at the Nassau Coliseum on Long Island.
Oh, it's possible. Yeah.
We had three teams on Long Island: the Nets, the Islanders, and the Jets.
Right.
And I don't think we really have any of them anymore. I think the Islanders
came back.
Oh, are they back there permanently? I know for a while they were playing most of their games somewhere else, but would periodically just go back and play at the Coliseum for old time's sake.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether they built a new Coliseum or just completely overhauled the existing one. But I mean that arena I knew had been like 100 years old or something. Yeah. So, but I think that they are quite now permanent there again.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we have this issue here in DC too. I mean, we have
exactly.
They're now the Commanders, the Washington Commanders, who haven't played in Washington DC since the early '90s or something like that. Okay. Well, anyhow, a bit of a digression, but we'll have plenty of those today, I think. So, all right. So you grew up in New Jersey. You went to college in Massachusetts.
Yes.
And were you already sort of interested in the business of sports or sports law at that point, or did that interest come later?
Yeah, I mean, I'm old enough that I can say I'm not. It's not an exaggeration to say I learned to read in part from reading box scores of sports games when I was 6, 8, 10, and just ripped through sports encyclopedias when I was as a kid before we had Wikipedia and whatnot. So I went to UMass Amherst because they have one of the oldest and most prestigious, well-regarded sports management programs in the country. So went there to study the business of sport. And while there, some people knew probably before I did that I was probably going to be a lawyer, but started working with a professor that is a sports attorney, and gravitated towards that area, and then decided to go to law school.
And you went to law school basically right out of college?
Yes.
And where'd you go to law school?
I went to Fordham in New York, where I also got my MBA. And I went to New York for a variety of reasons, close to where I grew up. Lots of law firms, but also because it's sports presence. There's a lot of teams, most of the leagues, all the leagues are based there. Most of the unions are there. So heavy sports law presence there.
And was there, my experience in law school is that law education is very generalist. Like, at least when I was there wasn't really much specialization that occurred when you were a student, maybe beyond like some journals or a couple of classes. But what was your experience? You went in knowing that you wanted to do sports law, and was there an opportunity as a law student to start to develop that expertise?
It's a good question. And so a couple of things. One was being in New York, I began to have internships I had one with the Jets and worked with some sports agents and other things. So that was industry exposure. From a law school perspective, I knew of and identified certain courses that I knew were going to be important: labor, antitrust, and intellectual property being sort of the core things that I felt important to get an educational background in.
Because in some sense, sports law is kind of like a general corporate practice focused on a particular industry.
Yeah, and that's actually a very important point, is that the sports people who practice in sports are fond of saying this, like sports isn't a particular area of practice as much as it is the application of a wide range of areas of law to the sports industry. And that has pluses and minuses because in any given matter, a sports property, a team, a league, whatever, they could go choose an expert in it could be real estate or labor employment or copyright, whatever it may be, who has never worked in sports, and so the sports practitioners cover a range of practice areas, and there are some firms and some attorneys who specialize sort of in the application of their areas of law to the sports field.
Yeah. I went into law school sort of thinking that I was interested in sort of the theater and film business and doing entertainment law, but without really knowing what that meant. And I had a part-time job while I was in law school working for a lawyer who did entertainment law. And I quickly discovered exactly this point. Like, what he actually did day to day was negotiate contracts, do public offering memos, intellectual property stuff for his clients. And I quickly realized that I actually did not want to be a corporate lawyer. Like, I did not like reading through these very long, dense contracts, making sure that every cross-reference was right. But he would every now and then, one of his clients, he had a lot of like music industry clients, he'd represent sort of the artist side of the music industry. And they would periodically get in these little pieces of litigation where they'd have to sue for some royalties or some contract that got breached or whatever, and he didn't like to do the litigation, so he started letting me like write the complaints and the briefs, and I quickly discovered that I really liked that. And that was the moment where I was like, I don't want to do entertainment law. I actually want to be a litigator. But it's sort of the same thing. It's kind of like there is this sort of general corporate practice that is applied to that particular industry. Well, looking back on it now, like if somebody is listening to this conversation who is maybe thinking of going to law school or is in law school and they're interested in the sports world and maybe trying to get into that as a lawyer, like what advice would you give somebody? Let's take somebody who's in college and is thinking of going to law school, right? What advice would you give that person if they're interested in sports law and they're trying to decide maybe where to go to school for law and kind of how to treat their law school experience?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I have almost weekly calls with law students and about these types of things. And there's sort of two approaches. There are two schools that have very good sports law specific programs and certificate programs, Marquette and Tulane. But at the same time, obviously, with all due respect, they're not the highest ranked law schools. And when you go and look at the lawyers working for teams and leagues, it won't surprise you to find that they went to Harvard or NYU or Georgetown and then worked at Skadden and Covington and other top-notch law firms. So there's sort of two paths. Either way, my general recommendation is always that you absolutely have to go practice at a law firm for some handful of years, because sports organizations don't train lawyers, law firms do. And when you're doing that, you should focus on becoming the best lawyer you can be in whatever relevant practice area it is. Sports properties have the fortune of being highly desirable workplaces, and so people will willingly go work there at much less than they used to make, and probably at a lower position, and all kinds of things. And so you have to realize it's a very competitive marketplace, and so you have to be very good at what you do, which means being a very good lawyer. And just given the nature of the legal industry, if you're fortunate enough to be at a very good law school and then get into big law, and hopefully you find one of the big law firms that does some sports law work. You just have to sort of follow that path. And what I always tell people is be patient. You're going to have a 40 plus year career. You can always, be a very good lawyer and hopefully develop contacts in that field and circle back. If you are not of a T14 caliber, you may have a little bit more of a grind ahead of you. And sometimes you may be a little more local. You don't need a New York or DC or LA market. There's obviously sports teams in many cities of various sizes. Maybe you go to a law school in one of those. Maybe you're from Minnesota or St. Louis or something like that.
Yeah.
So either way, it is challenging both to pursue your legal career and also try and get a foot in the sports door at the same time.
Yeah, I was going to ask about the geography question because it sounded like you sort of made a conscious decision to go to New York in part because you thought there would be more opportunity there to get that foot in the door.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously had a geographical connection as it was, family and friends in the area. So, if I were from Oklahoma City, I may very well have made a different decision, but it was a very natural. I personally also always wanted to live in New York City, and I've spent a decade then living in Manhattan, and so it worked out on a variety of fronts that way.
All right, excellent. So after you graduated law school, maybe just kind of what was sort of the next thing that happened that kind of led you on the sports law path?
Yeah, so I was in law school. While I was in law school, the financial crisis happened, and the legal market changed. I also, I didn't have lawyers in my family, and so frankly, I very much wish I could go back and better understood the legal market as a law student. But I don't know how much it would have helped because the financial crisis changed a lot of that. But I had been doing a lot of work with Sports Stars, which is a major NFL player representation firm. They had like 100 clients in Manhattan. And they had an outside attorney they used on a variety of matters, and their clients did. A guy named Peter Ginsberg, who had previously been an assistant United States attorney and then had a white collar and civil practice at a variety of large firms before having his own practice. And so through them, started working with him and spent 4 years working with him, which was, and again, sort of similar to what you were saying. I didn't know that I necessarily wanted to be a litigator. It just sort of where I got a job and now I'm a litigator and I don't regret that, I suppose. And so with Peter, got to do a lot of, very good litigation, commercial and securities and labor and employment, those kinds of things. And also, a third plus of the practice or so was sports related, particularly representing NFL players, which he had done a lot of, often in league matters when they got disciplined by the commissioner or failed a drug test, those kinds of things.
Yeah, that's interesting. So this distinction between litigators and corporate lawyers, right? So, people listening may not, if you're not a lawyer and you're listening to this, you may not totally grasp that distinction, but like at a very, very high level of generality, I would say most lawyers kind of fall into one of those two buckets. They're either people who represent people in court, we call those litigators, or they're people who sort of advise and counsel businesses and work on business issues, and we call those corporate lawyers. So when I think of sports law, I think of it primarily as a corporate law practice, but is there a path into sports law on the litigation side? I mean, obviously there is litigation. I mean, the leagues get into lawsuits, the teams get into lawsuits, the players get into lawsuits. But it's interesting to hear that this person that you worked for had started out as a prosecutor at the U.S. Attorney's Office and then somehow got into sports law. So is there a path for litigators into the sports law world?
So in outside counsel world, there absolutely is, because as you indicated, sports teams and individuals are engaged in all kinds of litigation all the time. In-house is a little different. And I've actually written a law review article examining the career paths of general counsels in sports. And it's a personal issue to me because I was general counsel of DC United of Major League Soccer for 2.5 years. The vast majority of in-house counsel at sports teams come from a corporate transactional background. Some teams have specialty needs, like maybe they're building a new stadium and they get someone who has some real estate experience or something. But most come from a transactional background, corporate background. There are a sprinkling of litigators, and I remember having this discussion with a guy named Andy Lee, who was General Counsel of the New York Jets for a period of time. He had come from Proskauer, which does a tremendous amount of sports work, and he had largely been a litigator there. He's now at Foley and Lardner in New York. But his point on this issue was, well, who knows what, as you transition from, say, being a litigator to in-house where you're doing a lot more transactional work, who knows the holes better in a contract than a litigator who sues about, such holes. So I know he was a successful transition. I'd like to think I was as well. And I personally think it's a little overblown because when I was in-house with DC United, yes, I would say at least more than half of my time was doing transactions, commercial agreements, vendor agreements, all different kinds of contracts. But the vast majority of them are between 5 and a dozen pages that any competent litigator would be well aware of the provisions and can draft them. If we had a couple that were 50, 60 pages of some type, and yes, I would go get outside counsel help on that. But I think any good lawyer can certainly make that in-house transition.
Yeah. But just statistically speaking, the in-house lawyers tend to come from the corporate side.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. So you worked you worked for Peter Ginsberg for a while. What was sort of the next step on your path?
Yeah. So while working with Peter, and Peter again he for well more than a decade at that point had become a prominent attorney representing NFL players in various disputes, particularly league matters. And so Peter had a very pro employee labor bend in terms of protecting their often procedural rights and related types of issues. And so I had internalized and had been working with agents, very much a pro NFL player stance. In terms of, I'd learned a lot about different issues that affected them. And in 2014 concussions was obviously a major issue. And so in 2011, the NFL and NFLPA had a new collective bargaining agreement, a 10-year collective bargaining agreement, and they had agreed to set aside some money for research on player health issues. Unfortunately, they couldn't agree on how to use the money, and they split it into two buckets. The NFL gave some to NIH, and the NFLPA went out and sent out requests for proposals to major universities to do research in this area. And Harvard ended up winning it. And one of the buckets was a law and ethics portion, as it was called, and and ultimately I joined that portion in May of 2014. I joined, there were two lawyer/bioethicists at Harvard that had experience in health law, bioethics, but no sports law experience. And so they needed to bring in a sports law expert to help do that work. And so I came aboard, and our portion of the project was a designated 3 years. There were agreed upon reports projects ahead of time. And we produced a whole bunch of different publications during that time. I always want to be clear that the NFLPA had no ability to control our work. We always treated the league and the union equally, gave them certain opportunities to review our work and comment, and both were equally cooperative and uncooperative at times.
So, that's really fascinating. So there's a lot of things in there I want to ask you about. So the first thing is that maybe just say a word about what the project was primarily focused on. Was it an attempt to study NFL concussions from a medical health perspective, or were they and why did they need a lawyer?
So the soundbite for the project is we were studying legal and ethical issues that affect NFL player health. And we defined health very broadly, as actually I think as the World Health Organization does too. So not just physical health, but mental health, social health, financial health, a lot of those different kinds of factors. And so concussions was always in the background, but was not in any way like a focus of our work.
Okay. So it wasn't like a medical research study.
No, we studied, a lot of our work was around labor and employment laws, health laws, and a lot of these types of laws that apply to the NFL and sports workplace, but historically have not been applied, had not been litigated, and ways in which players could avail themselves of certain protections. And also, a big focus of it was proposing changes to the NFL collective bargaining agreement that, frankly, we considered to be non-controversial, because player health should not be a subject of adversarial bargaining. It should sort of be viewed as a win-win in terms of different things that can be improved to protect player health. Frankly, the biggest part of our study and our work, biggest theme, was focusing on conflicts of interest in the healthcare setting, because in sports you have a situation in which clubs retain the doctors, and the doctors can be heavily influenced by the coaches, the general managers, and at the same time that they're treating players, they're also providing advice to the club about the player's injury, his long-term or short-term usefulness, maybe whether to sign that guy to another contract, those kinds of things. And you should always want to be clear, the vast majority of doctors working in sports are highly qualified experts, but there is what we call a structural conflict of interest that creates, a less than ideal healthcare setting.
Yeah, that is really interesting. I've often kind of wondered about this. I think it's particularly acute in football, just because the injuries are almost part of the game, right? In other words, you cannot watch an NFL football game without watching somebody get carted off the field. It's just like there's a certain percent. It's like there's a casualty
100% injury rate.
Yeah. And like every game has a certain percentage of casualties, guys that are coming out of the game, and some of them you'll never see again, right? And there's always as a fan just watching it on TV, right? The play ends, everybody walks off the field except the one guy who's still lying there, and then this team of people run out onto the field to check on him and help him, right? Who I assume are like part of the training or medical staff that work for the team. Yeah, and now that you say it, I mean, it's sort of obvious, right? Like, what is their job at that moment? Is it to get the guy back on the field so that the team can win? Or is it to, make the best medical judgment for the benefit of the player? Like, having worked in that field, what do you think that medical staff is thinking about at that moment when they're treating a player that's injured on the field?
Yeah, it's a good question. And in fact, the last couple of CBAs, or in the last 5, well, going back to the 2011 CBA between the NFL and NFLPA, all 4 of the major sports leagues, I believe at this point, have incorporated into their collective bargaining agreement an accepted standard of care. And they've tried to say, what is the doctor's obligation? And some of them have phrased it as like a primary duty of care. And a lot of it has been words that just don't hold up when you start breaking them apart, because they're not really possible. I do think, in fairness to those club medical staff, they are responding appropriately and doing the best they can for the player's interest at that moment. And that is overwhelmingly and generally the case. I think but
it's tricky though, because there was a fairly dramatic incident of this here in DC when RG3 was the quarterback for what was then the Washington Redskins, and had some pretty serious injuries to his legs, and they kept putting him back out there, right? And later, there was, I think, he sort of took the position publicly that he thought those decisions were made really without his best interests in mind.
Yeah.
And so I imagine that, like, whatever language is in those CBAs about how the doctors and trainers are supposed to act, they do work for the team, and they're answering to the coach in that moment, I assume, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, maybe not. I mean, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but in some sense, like, they're communicating with the coach or the coaching staff, who have to make a decision about what to do with that player. And like, whose decision is it really about whether to keep the player in or take him out?
there are layers to this, and it's evolved a lot over time. For sure, historically, massive problems in terms of doctors violating clearly their ethical obligations. There's books written about the Raiders in the 70s and the Seahawks in the 80s, just really not appropriate and bad things. Over time, so the CBAs, particularly the NFL CBA, delineates literally here's 20 doctors you have to have, and they cover everything you can imagine. Orthopedic down and out. There's a variety of mental health specialists they have to have, but like ear, nose, and throat, and all kinds of things, cardiovascular. The doctors are not employees, are almost always independent contractors, usually as a result of an affiliation with the hospital. Where this is a sidebar, but medical sponsorship is a major issue. The leagues have differing approaches in terms of, well, if a major hospital pays $5 million to be a sponsor, do they have the right to choose the club doctor? And that is the case, in the NFL, in the NHL and MLS. The NFL actually is the most restrictive about those types, and generally doesn't allow that. Trainers are usually employees, and so historically, or even today, the way the trainers have the closest relationship with the coaches because they're there every day. Mm-hmm. Some people refer to them as like the bartender of the team. And the doctors are only there 1 or 2 days a week. And so the flow of information goes from doctor to trainer and sort of that way. Coaches for sure have gotten much better about, you tell me what the decision is, and I'll follow it. But the subtle pressures, conscious or unconscious, absolutely still exist, and I think that's the problem. We had in our work had come up with an alternative structure in which the PA would play a role in selecting, reviewing, and deciding sort of the fate of club medical staff, and also further bisecting the level of communication between medical staff and the coaching staff or the executives. Also, I don't believe club medical staff should be advising, say, the general manager about a player's short-term or long-term usefulness, because I think that's clearly contrary to the player's interests. If the club wants to get a doctor to figure out whether this guy's knee is bad enough that he shouldn't be signed to a 3-year contract, go get a different doctor than the doctor that's treating the player. Mm-hmm. I think it's problematic that the doctor treating a player is also telling the club that.
And so today, what is the status of that?
Today, the club doctor has divided loyalties, and they wear a lot of different hats. And so as a result, there's a breakdown at times in the level of trust between a player and his treating doctor, which is antithetical to the idea of a productive, doctor-patient relationship.
Are the players allowed to go get their own doctors if they don't want to be treated by the team doctor, or does the team have the right to basically say, no, you have to follow the advice of our chosen doctor?
In all sports, they have the right to a second opinion, and it varies across the sports the degree to which that is respected. The NFL, it's standard practice, and no clubs really fight back on it. Where it becomes more tricky is, does the player then have the right, let's say the second opinion doctor disagrees with the team doctor, mm-hmm. who gets to decide? Mm-hmm. In the NFL and Major League Baseball, players get to choose. They can choose what they want. In the NHL, players have to do what the team doctor supposedly says, mm-hmm. which I think violates some bioethical principles, because they're losing control over their body, mm-hmm. in terms of making a choice about how they're going to be touched and treated medically, and I don't think that's appropriate. But for sure, there are sometimes heated disputes behind the scenes between doctors about what the appropriate course of treatment is, and that again, these types of things can add to, well, maybe this player's a problem. Maybe we don't want him anymore.
Yeah. So that's interesting. So you said the NHL has the most restrictive, or gives the team the most authority over the medical decisions. Yeah. So, I mean, are there cases like in the NHL where that has led to controversy, where like a team doctor said, I mean, I can imagine situations, for example, where like you might have a player who is hurt, and the team doctor might say, well, I can give you a shot of some painkiller or some steroid that'll, the pain will go away. You can get back on the ice tomorrow, play. And the player just doesn't want to do that. it thinks, okay, well, that's not going to actually heal me, right? I mean, because there is this sort of, there's pain management that I assume happens in all professional sports,
Right.
and then there's the actual like underlying problem that you're trying to fix, right? And it's hard to sometimes fix the problems in the middle of the season if you're trying to stay on the ice or stay on the field, right?
Yeah.
And I can see like maybe is that sort of where the controversies tend to arise, like the difference between the long-term care, a player who's might think I have to get healthy so I can come back year after year after year. I've got a short career as it is.
Yeah.
I don't want to totally destroy my knee just to play one more game versus the team who has the player under contract then and wants to win the next game. Like, right? Is that kind of where the controversy tends to crop up?
A couple of things. One, so in the NHL, there has been a major, and recently was a major dispute in this area. A major young player named Jack Eichel was on the Buffalo Sabres and had a spinal injury. And the team doctor says, you have to do this. And he didn't play I think all of last season and beginning of parts of this season because he said, no, my doctor wants to do this. Eventually they traded him, and the new team, the Las Vegas Knights, allowed him to do the surgery that he wanted. But it was a major issue. But to your second question, yes, those are certainly issues. The trickiness here sometimes is you also have to respect players' rights to make a decision. And so a large part of our work is not taking away player choice to say, hey, I'd rather have the painkiller. It's about providing them the ability to make an informed decision. Mm-hmm. And that can be challenging in a variety of respects, particularly around concussions. The science is evolving and we're learning new things. And same with other injuries, right? Like medical science evolves and there's different treatment methods. But one of the fascinating things is, well, there's a couple of things. One, players have incredible optimism bias. They think, well, I know the average NFL career may be 3 to 5 years. I'm going to play 10 years. I know that, that guy tore his ACL. That's never going to happen to me. And that is both a detriment and a positive because, guys have to, the NFL, the level to be successful in the NFL is sort of razor thin. And if you have a doubt about, well, I don't know if I want to go make that tackle, I might hurt my knee, you're probably going to end up losing your job. You have to play with a degree of controlled reckless abandon and put your body on the line. And so you have to think like a warrior that you can't get hurt. And as a result, you may get hurt. And it's important always to remember, too, that the players, particularly in the NFL, many of them are making choices against constrained background socioeconomic issues. Many of the NFL players obviously come from lower income communities in the South. They're black, and so they're already at a variety of disadvantages in terms of their educational and career options that become even more narrowed as society and their community tells them you're a football player. And so it's very hard for them to imagine not being a football player. And so you can easily end up in situations where the medical staff's doing everything appropriate, telling them, hey, you could take this, but it presents serious risks. And the player says, I don't care. Shoot me up. I'm back on the field. And they may regret that 20 years down the road. And so it's a difficult balance.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you're sort of saying it's the players who are actually pushing to get back on the field.
Sometimes, many times, yes.
Yeah, because they see like, oh, if I'm not out on the field and I'm not, with the team, what's going to happen to me?
Right, exactly.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I can see how all of these things are kind of at their height in football, just again, because the injuries are sort of built into the game.
Yeah.
Whereas in the other major professional sports, I guess you could say the injuries happen, but they're always unintentional. They're always maybe
injury rates are a little lower.
Yeah, I mean, hockey is a pretty high contact sport too, but they don't seem to get hurt at the same rate as the football players do.
Correct.
And there's some norms against like intentionally hurting each other, that that the players enforce themselves.
Right.
Sometimes baseball, obviously it's not a contact sport. Players get hurt sort of by accident all the time, but it's a little different there. Yeah, I mean, so that's interesting. So you worked at Harvard on that project for 3 years. What was sort of the end result? Was there a report?
Yeah.
And then what were there recommendations that actually got implemented, or was there pushback? Or?
So the first we did multiple reports. One was about 500 pages, and it looked at 20 different stakeholders in player health. So players themselves, the teams, coaches, trainers, doctors, agents, etc., and understanding their legal and ethical obligations and making recommendations. We did another report. It was like 250 pages, looking at different policies and practices across the leagues, again, making recommendations. Then there were a variety of smaller law review articles and academic publications on conflicts of interest. And we did OSHA and ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, and Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. So a bunch of different publications that had recommendations in them. So what I enjoyed was they negotiated a new CBA in 2020. I immediately took that new CBA and went digging to see all the changes. And I feel comfortable in saying that there were a great many that some were literally word verbatim things we had recommended were now in the CBA.
Oh, that's great.
And so I wrote a whole new law review article, sort of, hey, here's all the things we said, and here's the things they changed. Here's still like problem areas.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. Well, it's good to hear that some of it actually got implemented. I mean, do you think the trend in professional sports is sort of positive from the players? I mean, even if it's not perfect now, is the trend in a positive direction from a player health perspective?
Yeah, I mean, yes. And going back to my earlier point, I think, it hasn't happened in the last year or two, but a couple of years ago, there was a handful of prominent NFL players who retired earlier in their career, still in their prime. And I thought that was a positive development in that those gentlemen were taking stock of where they were in their lives and their health and their opportunities and saying, I'm more than just a football player. And so I think with everything that's happened over the last 10, 15 years, litigation, movies, news reports of varying qualities, all of that, players are much more aware and informed. And I think from the NCAA level up, high school level, like there's just much better awareness. There are still certainly people who think these issues aren't important, but overall, I think there's been a lot of development in terms of players informing themselves so they can hopefully make informed decisions.
Yeah. Okay, that's good. All right. So fairly soon after you left the Harvard University study, I guess you had another stopping off point at another law firm, and then fairly quickly after that, became the general counsel of DC United, which is the professional soccer team here in Washington, DC. So how did you end up in that job?
Yeah, so going back to when I was working with agents, 10 years earlier, they had a variety of legal interns, and someone I knew there later became an executive at DC United, and they needed an in-house attorney for the first time, and he asked me if I was interested, and that's how I ended up there.
So you were their first general counsel?
Yeah, and even though they had been around for 25 years, so literally when I came in, there were no legal file or documents existed, which was mildly terrifying.
That's amazing, because I remember going to DC United games when they used to play at RFK many, many, many years ago.
Yeah.
So they had a whole league and they had a team, but they had no lawyer in house.
Yeah, and even when I joined, there's now 30 teams. Like when I joined, there may have been 26, and there were still a handful of teams that didn't have in-house counsel. Yeah. That has now everyone has in-house counsel, but these are MLS clubs are like small to mid-sized businesses. So do I think as a lawyer they should have had one earlier? For sure, but that wasn't a priority.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So there's obviously what we think of as I guess kind of the big four professional leagues, which are the four men's leagues in baseball, football, basketball, and hockey. But there are a lot of other professional sports leagues, both on the men's and the women's side, increasingly on the women's side, that have been in operation for a long time, and are maybe sort of growing over time. So like what is your kind of view of just the landscape in general, right, for sports lawyers? So you don't have to necessarily work for one of those 4 men's leagues. There's lots of other teams, there's lots of other leagues, there's minor leagues.
Yeah.
And what is that world like, and what are the opportunities in that world for lawyers?
Yeah, and a lot of it comes down to what is sort of considered in the sports industry, so to speak, right? And that can be a very broad term, because people work in broadcasting, and some part of their time may be sports related. Sports betting has become a major area, and so they have proliferated, all different providers, and they have lots of attorneys and are hiring. So that's some component of the sports industry. There are there are firms that invest in sports properties and are sort of private equity type funds, and they have sort of M&A attorneys in house that specialize in the sports industry. Mm-hmm. So again, like we sort of said earlier, there's lots of different avenues, but the leagues, if you end up with a team, you're still the same job duties still sort of generally apply, which is handling a lot of small commercial transactions, and then also I think labor and employment's a major area, because right. You're going to have 50 to 100 or 200 employees, and I did a lot of that at DC United and helping put in an employment infrastructure.
Yeah. I mean, I'm primarily a baseball fan if I had to pick one sport, and I've always thought it would just be fun to like work for or own like a small, single A minor league baseball team. That would just be like a fun little business to try to figure out. I mean, because each of those teams is its own little franchise, right?
Yeah, for sure. And
it has some owner who's trying to eke out. They probably don't make a lot of money, they're trying to figure out how to make some money in that system.
Yeah, so there's actually ongoing litigation, because Major League Baseball consolidated the minor leagues, so to speak, which squeezed out some sort of independent teams. And so increasingly the Major League Baseball clubs are exercising control over their affiliates, owning them, whereas previously there were much more sort of independently owned that were just affiliated by contract, because those are generally not profitable businesses. And sort of just going back to your point earlier, the 4 major leagues are profitable. Every NFL Major League Baseball team is profitable, probably every NBA team. At this point, it's unclear whether every NHL team is. Some of the Canadians maybe still lose some money. MLS teams are not profitable across the board.
So how do they survive if they're not profitable? They've been around for so many years; they're losing money all the time.
Just like the NWSL, the Women's Soccer League, or recent Lacrosse. All these, you need deep-pocketed investors who think it's worthwhile to invest in a sports property. And there's two ideas here. One is you could be like a lot of MLS clubs are owned by individuals or family entities that own NFL teams and other sports teams. And so if you lose $10 million on your MLS team, who cares? Because it's just writing off your taxes, your gains somewhere else, right?
Well, let me ask you this. There's sort of 2 parts to being the owner of a business. One is, do you make profit?
Yeah.
That's kind of like the cash flow question. The other thing is that you own a thing that could go up in value.
Exactly.
So is and there you can imagine a world where you might be losing a little bit of money each year on a cash flow basis, but the value of the property is going up in the sense that you could sell it to somebody else for a lot more than you bought it for.
And that's exactly right.
So, I mean, just because I know the soccer world, are the values of those franchises going up over time, or are they not really?
No, they have tremendously, and that is the main purpose of this ownership. And frankly, I'm not an investment banker, but I think the valuations are detached from financial reality in many cases. And this is true of a lot of the minor sports teams, because they are, but that's what they could buy in. Many people bought MLS teams for 20, 30, 50, or $100 million, and they're now worth $500 million only a decade or so later. That's a pretty good appreciation. Yeah. A big component now, though, of a lot of these sort of smaller leagues is the ancillary investments and ownership. So like at DC United, they lease property from the district for the stadium. They're also leasing a parcel right to the immediate east of the stadium that is now being developed with the same people who built the wharf. And so that's going to be a multi-$100 million property investment that DC United has a financial interest in. And this is true of lots of teams. Obviously, they're part of retail and commercial districts that they have a financial interest in.
So, but what is the fundamental explanation for a team that loses money year over year, but has gone up in value an order of magnitude during that time? I mean, how do you explain that?
Two things. One is the ancillary revenue and stadium. So like at DC United, we rented out the stadium to the Washington Spirit, to the XFL, and other events. So that ancillary revenue offsetting the losses, say, from the club bucket. And second,
so you're not so when you say that the team loses money, you're not including that ancillary revenue. You're just saying it loses money as a soccer team, but the franchise could make money other ways.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, yes, it depends on what your larger business is. Maybe you are just a small business, or maybe you're part of a very large business family, which some of these teams are. The second part is, I think, purely vanity. There are many billionaires in this country who, for vanity purposes, like buying and owning sports teams. And so $100 million premium may not be that big a deal for them when they're borrowing at, 2% interest.
Right. It's sort of the same explanation for why old baseball cards could be worth $1 million.
Yeah.
It's just because somebody wants to own it.
Exactly.
And like, if you're a billionaire,
yeah,
you might as well just own the team.
Yeah.
That's even better than owning the baseball card. You might as well just own the baseball team, right?
Right.
Yeah. And for whatever reason, those values seem to go up faster than
inflation,
like faster than any sort of economic reality. It's just sort of like the market for owning the thing is sort of,
because they're very small. There's a very small supply of them, right?
Right.
You got 120, 150, major sports teams in this country.
Right.
So, we have more than that many billionaires.
And it's not easy to start new ones, right? Because every now and then somebody says, well, let's start the XFL or whatever. What was the league that Herschel Walker played for?
The USFL.
The USFL, which was like really actually an attempt to try to compete against the NFL. And they almost always fail.
Correct.
I guess because the four major leagues are so big and so established at this point, it's just really hard to challenge them. But like certainly in the soccer world or in the women's sports world, or maybe you mentioned like lacrosse. I know the bowling league came back. So there are these sort of like smaller leagues. And do you think that's what the creators of those leagues are really thinking? That I go into it thinking, well, we're probably not going to really make money on a cash flow basis from this, but if we can kind of get it established, it can we can kind of, it's a ticket into this baseball card trading game where over time we'll be able to make money on it from selling it to the next person, the next person, the next person.
In part, and two things I'll mention. So I've done some work with like the NWSL and the Washington Spirit, and sometimes you have disputes among owners or of the team or even the leagues in terms of what is the goal, right? Like, do we just want to be a mom and pop store that sells tickets for $5 and can maybe squeak out a profit, or are we willing to lose $10 million and be a big time business? And so I think some of those leagues are still sorting that out. The Premier League Lacrosse, I'm not a big lacrosse person, but actually has a more interesting model in which that I think is trying to be sustainably profitable, which is they aren't like based in a city and they don't have a stadium. Instead, they have these teams and they move around and play tournaments in major cities.
Like the Harlem Globetrotters.
Yeah, and but they go up and down the northeast coast where there's big lacrosse communities, and they've removed a ton of overhead, right?
Right.
And so maybe in that way, and even the players can they can probably work, Monday through Friday, another job, and maybe that's a more sustainable business model.
That's interesting. And do you think they actually are kind of at least
they've
making a little bit by doing that?
At least thus, I have no insight into their financials, but I think thus far they've established a level of stability and marketability that is new and mildly impressive.
Yeah, lacrosse is an interesting sport, I went to a lacrosse heavy high school on Long Island where lacrosse was very big. And I went to Johns Hopkins undergrad where lacrosse was very big. I never played lacrosse and never had much interest. So it was just totally coincidence that I happened to be both in a high school and a college where lacrosse was king. But like it has a fanatic following, but its geographic scope, well, back then was very small. It was basically Maryland and New York, maybe a little bit of the South. Now it does seem to be growing, so it does look like there's potential there. And you can watch some lacrosse on TV now on ESPN and stuff like that. And there isn't yet an established giant league that you have to compete against. So it's almost like a new space that a sport could move into, and maybe over time, it's a fun sport to watch.
Yeah, I think some of these leagues, it's whether you're going to embrace being a niche sport or like. Are you going to try and challenge Major League Baseball? Like, frankly, MLS, some MLS owners have said, oh, we're going to pass Major League Baseball. And I think they're crazy. MLS should, they're very comfortably like a fifth league. Just sort of be happy there, because thinking you're going to pass Major League Baseball is not realistic,
right? Unless baseball destroys itself, which is a topic we'll get to in just a little bit. Okay, so let's kind of like finish up sort of like your sort of career arc, and then maybe we can dive into some of these items in the news. So you became the first general counsel of the DC United, and you worked there for about 2.5, 3 years, something like that. And like, so how was that experience? I mean, was that a fun job to have? I mean, like, was it sort of like when you went into this, the beginning going to law school thinking I want to be in the sports world, probably like becoming the general counsel of a franchise, you probably thought that would be the dream job. And then you sort of got it. And what was the reality?
Yeah, mixed, I would say. So one is, going back to what we talked about earlier about different areas of law applying to sports. One of the things I absolutely loved about the job was getting to touch so many different areas of law. Like I mentioned that we did a lot of contracts, that I did a lot of employment work, that we had that real estate development. I continued to litigate for us on some arbitrations and things of that nature. But, we were a creditor. When the XFL went bankrupt, we were a creditor, and I was on the creditors committee. I dealt a lot with insurance. So I was dealing with a wide range of areas of law, learning about new areas of law, which I really, really enjoyed. Intellectual property continued to, is certainly a big aspect of sports. I think, in time, I started off my career being like, oh, I just care about sports, not the law. And every year it sort of like has changed a little bit. I'm more interested in the law than sports. So for sure, going to games and those kinds of things is exciting. And you deal with a lot of young people who, are starting their careers, particularly in MLS, and which I really enjoyed. I used to do like lunch and learns. I'd bring in local DC professors to talk about, physics or geopolitics or all kinds of things. Mm-hmm. But the challenges are the industry, as I was sort of saying, is still constrained. It's resource limited. And so you wish you had more people, more support, more money, obviously, to do certain things that can make it, a challenging workplace at times.
Yeah. I mean, so I guess that is the thing. People probably go into sports law because they love sports, and then discover that it's really just law, right? This is kind of like, this was sort of the discovery that I made in law school, like working for the entertainment lawyer, that like I was interested in theater and film and music, but being a lawyer in that world was just being a lawyer. It's just that your clients were eccentric artists, who were hard to deal with. So it actually was not that appealing as a law thing. But I mean, is there still sort of like, do you still get a kick out of just sort of that being behind the scenes of the show, so to speak? Like, is there something fun about that still, or did that wear off after a while?
When I began as an undergraduate to study the business of sport, and then when I was actually doing more work in that area in law school, my mind very much switched from less focusing, say, on like what's going on the field, to like I read less articles about like who's trading who or who's going to draft who, as much as, you know, if there's an article about the labor negotiations, I'm absolutely reading that, or some new lawsuit or some other legal issue. Those things interest me. So I know I've talked to people in the sports industry, even non-lawyers. If you're in a stadium, you're probably not focusing on the field as much as like, oh, there's that advertisement over there. I wonder how much they're paying per year for that, and you know, different things going on. Or I often also oversaw the operations for periods of time, and so you're worried about 20,000 people coming in, security, and all different. And we didn't even talk about like COVID, but that was a whole other animal. So for sure, you know, knowing what goes into a successful operation, a sports operation, hoping people enjoyed it, hoping you win, is neat and exciting when things go well. When things don't go well, and you know, obviously you're in the public eye a little bit too, and so you know, people can write comments and articles, and they could be poorly informed, and you just sort of ride with it, which is a little less fun.
Yeah. So it sounds like maybe becoming a sports lawyer kind of ruined the sports fandom experience for you a little bit.
Ruined, or at least changed, I would say. And going back to even when I was studying sports in college, you begin to develop an interest in different things. When you're at a game, you may be looking less at the action on the field as much as, you know, the billboards around the arena, wondering how much did that sponsor pay to be there. And so you really have to have a passion for the business and law of sports, not just sports itself. And I sometimes tell people to read a book by Jim Quinn. Jim Quinn had a long, about 50-year career at Weil Gotshal, where he was involved in nearly every major antitrust litigation in sports. And he recently semi-retired and wrote a book called Don't Be Afraid to Win about his career. And I tell people, if you read that book and it doesn't get you excited, maybe you shouldn't be a sports lawyer. You should just continue to be a sports fan.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I think that can be true of a lot of areas of the law. Like as a lawyer, you get really in the weeds on a lot of issues, and then you read about them in the paper, and you're like, no, that's not really right.
Right,
you know,
right.
like, or you see it at some sort of like other description that sort of the general public gets of what's going on. So, and I think this is like a good moment where we should maybe get into some of those things that people have been reading about,
Sure,
in the newspapers recently, and maybe you can kind of give us the insider sports lawyer perspective. But just to kind of close the circle on your career, so you stayed at DC United for about 2.5 years, and then you left and went back kind of into private practice. And you still represent clients in the sports industry, right?
Yes, and my practice has even become more eclectic since then. I've done some things for some teams, sort of along the lines I was doing, some transactional work, but done some corporate governance work and some products liability work. But then, you know, even sports betting, and then it seems NFTs are unavoidable, so I've been dragged into that space a little bit as well.
Okay, well, we don't even go there because we don't have time to talk about NFTs. That'll be like we'll have to do a whole nother podcast about NFTs. That's an interesting phenomenon. It's sort of like the modern day baseball card thing, though, I think is basically what that is. Collectors just bidding up the value on things that from the outside don't seem to really have any value. But that's interesting. All right, so let me just kind of ask you about some things that have been in the news lately, and maybe you can kind of give us that insider perspective, or at least explain how a sports lawyer might be thinking about these. So probably the most recent thing is the Major League Baseball lockout that just ended last week. Spring training has now started. I mean, we're recording this on March 17th. I think spring training just started this week, basically, almost a month late. I think they're going to try to preserve a 162 game season, but starting
right.
Opening day is going to be pushed back a little bit. They'll make up the game somewhere along the way, I guess. So the season has been salvaged. It was at risk for a while there. And I sort of followed it a little bit from like a fan's perspective, you know, just reading in the newspaper. And, you know, it's hard to really tell what they were fighting about when you read just, you know, what you hear in the news. I think from the fan's perspective, it's always like, all right, so it's the billionaire owners on one side and Max Scherzer as the face of the players on the other, guy who just signed a $48 million a year contract with the Mets. It's like, all right, they're just fighting over money. you know, and just like, and from a fan's perspective, it's like, there's so much money. Just flip a coin, figure out how to divide it up and go forward. You're all getting rich, right? But maybe that's not really true. So like what, from a sports lawyer's perspective, what were they really fighting about? And then maybe you just give us your take on the outcome, like who won?
So I'll sort of, since you sort of mentioned the flip of the coin, I'll sort of start from there and work backwards because there is an inherent sense of fairness that I think people would think like, just split it 50-50, right? Like maybe that's the way it should be. It is a lot of money, right? Baseball has not developed that way for a couple of different historical reasons. Baseball has a really long, well-documented history of litigation and pseudo exemptions from antitrust law. There's a series of Supreme Court cases from 1922, 1953, and 1972 that for a long time said baseball was fully exempt from antitrust law. In 1998, that changed, and Congress passed a law called the Curt Flood Act, who had been the plaintiff in the 1972 litigation, that at least said, as it applies to the labor market, baseball is subject to antitrust law. In the 70s, a variety of things happened, and there was the development of what's called the non-statutory labor exemption, and essentially, like all the leagues now, they developed collective bargaining agreements to decide terms and conditions and wages of employment. In the 70s, baseball developed its free agency model and strictures that still exist to today. And in baseball, you are not a free agent until you've accrued at least 6 years of service time, essentially been in the league for 6 years. If you tack on a couple of years in the minor leagues, you have close to a decade in which you have no ability to decide your employer, the location of your employer, and or to offer your services to the highest bidder. Your salary is constrained by the rules in the collective bargaining agreement. So that in and of itself, I think, is mildly remarkable. I don't think there's any other private industry or any industry in this country in which, for a decade or so, you can't be in the free market.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. So, like from a lawyer perspective, that would be like you come out of law school, and then the law firms have a draft, and you get picked by law firm X.
Right.
And then you have to work for that law firm for 6 years, and no other law firm is allowed to hire you.
Right.
Right.
So
that's how the baseball players operate.
And so let's even say, like, let's say you get drafted by a major firm, but they say, well, before you're ready, you have to go do products liability for 3 years in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. You know, and you don't have a choice. It's either do that or go find a new line of work. And that the players accept this. That's part of the negotiation, provided they, you know, and they request certain amounts of money to sort of have that stricture. In all the other leagues over time, they developed salary caps. And with the salary caps, then slowly also became salary floors that teams had to spend a certain amount. And a revenue sharing model has developed in the NHL, NBA, and NBA, NHL, and NFL, in which the players and teams roughly split 50-50 the money that comes in. The baseball union has been one of the strongest unions in America, not just in sports. Their roots are from a guy named Marvin Miller, who had been a labor economist for steelworkers in Pennsylvania. And so they are a strong union, and they have a history of holding firm, you know, the 1994 strike being the biggest example, which they eventually, you know, won in large part with the help of an opinion from then District Judge Sotomayor. And so that system has prevailed. And in about maybe 10, 12 years ago, Major League Baseball implemented not a salary cap, but luxury tax, a salary. And so if teams went above a certain amount, they'd have to pay a tax that would then be redistributed to the very poor clubs. And the players thought this was good because there's still theoretically unrestrained spending. In fact, they've now slowly gotten a lower and lower percentage of the share of revenue. I think it's now estimated they're only getting like 43%. So going into this negotiation, I thought there was going to be the players. Look, the system they're operating is almost 50 years old. Like very few things continue to operate well after 50 years. That it needed to be revisited. And one of the major issues was, we're talking about 6 years, is teams had figured out a way to manipulate quote unquote, their service time, so that essentially players needed 7 years. They would, to prevent a guy from getting his 6 years, would keep him in the minor leagues for the first month or two of his career, so that he would, at end of his 6th year, he would have 5.75 years, not 6, and was not a free agent. And so,
because you need 6 years of major league time.
Yeah. Yes. Every day you're on.
Is there a limit to how much minor league time the teams can impose on the players?
Generally, no. I mean, when you're in the minor leagues, depending on if you're a first round pick, you can like negotiate, like a split contract and different kinds of contracts. But a lot of those guys are like sort of year to year, just hustling, trying to find a job.
But they're under team control.
Yes, every year. But if they don't do well, they could have to move on. But when you're on a major league roster, then you're accruing service time, and that goes towards the free agency calculations. So I thought, and the players were concerned about this service time manipulation. And so ultimately I thought they may try, and I should clarify that I know this gets complicated, but after 2 years or 3, after 3 years, players are allowed to go to salary arbitration. And there's a subgroup called Super Twos that can also go, and they can get higher salaries, but still on 1-year deals and not be in a free market. I thought generally the players were going to try and change the system substantially for the first time in 50 years. And that ultimately didn't happen. The system stayed the way it is for the large part. They did a couple of things to try and discourage the lower level teams from sort of tanking and manipulating the system by now having a draft lottery for the lower level teams. And then also now there is I think it's a $50 million bucket they agreed on that players in salary arbitration can get access to based on performance. And so the clubs, rather than say free up the market, allow players to operate a little more in a free market, are just providing more money to reward performance, which is, still a very different thing than a free market, obviously. So at the end of the day, it did very much come down to money. I know the players wanted, I talked about having a salary floor, because there are a variety of teams that are perceived as who have $30 million payrolls, who are not trying to win, and they're collecting revenue sharing money from the Yankees or the Dodgers or the Mets. And those owners can make very large profits, even if they put out a 60 and 100 team. That didn't change either. There was not a salary floor. So I came away a little surprised that things didn't change more. From the players' perspective, I'm a little bit disappointed. They've said, it's incremental change. It's, I think, a 4 or 5 year CBA. We'll sort of see. I mean, in large part, baseball and its owners have I'm trying to think of the right words, like a less than rosy picture in terms of their attitudes towards labor and their employees and how their businesses should be run. Frankly, they're perceived as being quite greedy. And they're in the 1980s. They lost
more greedy than NFL owners, or
yeah,
or is it just that it's a different history? I mean, baseball had this history where before the 70s, I mean, the players really were like indentured service.
Yeah.
I mean, which they basically had no ability to negotiate. I mean, there's all sorts of famous stories about, I don't know, I forget who. I think there's some story about like Joe DiMaggio like going to the Yankees or asking for a raise and basically being told, pound sand, where are you going to go?
Exactly.
And I'm sure that happened all the time. They basically had to go beg the owners for a little more money each year.
Yeah,
that's all they could do.
So in the 80s, in the collective bargaining agreement, eventually they had agreed that the clubs wouldn't collude, because that seems obvious. That's sort of an underpinning of antitrust law and free market capitalism. But in the 80s, the teams colluded a ton on some star players, and they lost a whole bunch of arbitrations about it and had to pay a bunch of players hundreds of millions of dollars in damages. So the owners just have a very negative history of cooperation. And that's why I think this time around, the stories and the media was perceived as being much more player friendly. And all this is in the background of the fact that baseball has some serious issues in terms of fandom, level of interest. And, Rob Manfred is a brilliant attorney from Harvard. And I think either Proskauer or Skadden. But is he putting on the best face for the league? Is highly questionable.
Yeah. And then there was this sort of interesting thing that happened right at the end where I guess the union had, I guess they're like an elected executive committee that are players that are supposed to sort of lead the negotiations. And as I understand it, the players that were on the executive committee were not particularly in favor of this deal, but that under the union rules, the whole union kind of gets to vote at some point, and the players as a whole voted to take it.
Yeah.
Which to me sort of suggested that there are some players that maybe see things the way you do and kind of maybe saw a possible moment for some bigger change, but that as a group, they just kind of wanted to get back to work and get their next paycheck. Like maybe they're like just kind of the majority of the players, I don't know if they're, maybe they're not as focused on all of these issues, or they're just thinking much more short term. I mean, it's hard to think long term when you're an athlete, I think, because your career is so short. But like, what do you think accounted for that sort of split between the leadership and the rank and file of the union?
That's a very good point. It's a historical, an ongoing challenge for sports unions, during which their players' involvement in a union is quite small, and many players may only go through one CBA negotiation. And so it's understandable that hundreds of guys are only going to play a couple of years, and they can't afford to lose a year, and they need to maximize their earnings now. And so there's clearly differences of opinion within the union. The executive committee, as many people point out, were generally very highly paid players, may have had a better historical understanding of certain issues, and were willing to go to the mat, because obviously Max Scherzer doesn't care from a financial standpoint if he didn't play.
Yeah. I mean, he was saying, to his credit, he was saying publicly, look, I don't really, he was sort of saying, I don't really care personally that much about the outcome of this, because I've already made my $300 million. It doesn't really matter. I'm doing this for the future of the players that are going to come after me.
Yeah.
And if we take that at face value as being true, then he was maybe pushing for some changes that would have been a little more transformative.
Yeah.
But also, to get to those changes would have dragged out the lockout. I mean, that was the thing. Like, it's like the unions. I mean, in any union negotiation, I guess the union members are faced with this dilemma, particularly when they were locked out, which was the owner's choice. I take it they didn't have to lock out the players, but they did it to put pressure on them for exactly this reason, right? Which is, during the lockout, the players were not going to get their paychecks at some point, and the union would run out of money to compensate them, and that kind of focuses the rank and file of the union on the day-to-day more than the long term, I guess.
You're exactly right. I mean, it's a issue I'm sure all unions deal with in terms of solidarity and who needs money more. And although the sports unions have created lockout funds, it's an enormous amount of money that you can't possibly fill in.
Yeah. Now, I have to say that as a fan, I have a very divided reaction to all of this, because on the one hand, I'm, just instinctually on the side of the players. I don't care who owns the team. I'm not a fan of the owners of the team. I'm a fan of the team, which to me means the players, right?
Right.
And so, I'm rooting for the players to get the best deal they can get. On the other hand, what the players want generally in every sport is sort of unlimited freedom and bargaining power, which is negative from a fan perspective, because we have this phenomenon where the teams are so transient, right?
Yeah.
My team, the Nats, they won the World Series in 2019, and within 2 years of that, I mean, almost everybody that had been on that team, with a few exceptions, had moved on.
Right.
And so every year the team is almost reconstituted. The team tries to find a few players that they'll have some continuity of and make them the quote unquote face of the team. Ryan Zimmerman as long as Ryan Zimmerman was on the team, it was the Nats, even though the cast of characters around him was constantly shifting. Right. And so it's very hard to, as a fan, to kind of like develop the kind of like attachment to the team that you kind of instinctually want as a fan. Right. And so there is this tension, like on the one hand, like I'm rooting for the players to get the best deal they can. But what that usually means is that there's going to be a lot more transience, a lot more movement. The teams themselves become less the product and the players become more the product, right? I mean, is that a fair way to kind of think about it?
Well, I'm always reminded, Jerry Seinfeld said, you're rooting for laundry. You're just rooting for like the jersey,
Right.
But,
right.
It's interesting in baseball because baseball, I think, is the last league that doesn't have a maximum contract length. All the other leagues are restricted in some ways 4 or 5 or 6 years. Baseball, you could still sign like a 10-year contract.
Why would there be a restriction on
so club owners love to restrict their profligate brethren.
They don't want to even have to like hear the ask. So they just say, I'm never going to give you a contract that's more than 4 years. Don't even ask.
The CBA is restricted because they know someone's going to be reckless and give an 8-year contract, and the market's all blown up. But I mean, for sure, you're right. I mean, and that's when it comes down to, again, a lot of this is about the degrees of free market. And if you're a team that wants to win, are you willing to commit to a bunch of guys for 4 or 5 years and sign lengthy contracts? Going back to sort of the salary arbitration, with the advent of much more statistics involvement in baseball in the last 10, 15 years, 20 years, I think a lot of teams try to win within the window in which they easily control players, when they're 0 to 6 years. Yeah. And then if they become a free agent and sign a $300 million deal somewhere else, that's fine. I mean, the Tampa Bay Rays have been very successful with guys that are, in their early mid-20s, not making a whole lot of money.
Yeah, and then the teams from the smaller cities almost have to do that, right? Because they will just never have the same amount of money as the Yankees and the Mets and the Dodgers have, right? Yeah. It is interesting because sometimes those teams are successful, right? Yeah. I mean, you can point to Tampa Bay or Oakland or Kansas City Royals were doing it for a while. I mean, so there are always some like small market teams that manage to pull together. I don't know why the Orioles have been so bad for so many years. I mean, the story is they were the last team in Major League Baseball to like develop an analytics department, right? So they just fell behind. But but you can win in baseball with less money, and I guess that is a function of the fact that they do have these service time requirements.
Yes. So they know they control players for 6 years or so, and they identify their group of minor leaguers, and then they try and move that block all at the same time, and they have a 3 to 4 year window, which maybe to try and win a title.
Yeah. So we'll probably never see like another team like the Yankees of the 1950s and 60s. Like that will just never happen again. Where you can, they had just great stars at every position, and those stars could never leave and go anywhere. So, Joe DiMaggio and Yogi Berra and Mickey Mantle, and they all played for the Yankees and never for anybody else.
I think a good analogy is sort of like the Golden State Warriors in the NBA. Yeah. They won a bunch of titles and had like essentially all stars at every position, and that lasted like 3 to 4 years, but it just is not sustainable.
Oh yeah, well in the NBA the stars pick they pick the teams. I mean it's almost. Yeah, I mean, at least that's the sense from the fans' perspective. Like you get the sense that like the top 20 players in the NBA kind of get together in the offseason and decide which team is going to win that year. I mean, I mean, it's like LeBron and a few of his buddies get together and like, okay, who's going to win this year?
I mean, that's obviously just a side effect of the fact that it's like 5 guys on a court at a time, not 20 or something.
Yeah. But but it is mixed in with the business and the law, right? The players are able to do that because of the way that their league is structured.
Yeah. And in the NBA is fascinating because there's many guys who turn down long-term deals. They may take 1 or 2 year deals for lots of money, knowing that their injury risk is lower, and so they can continuously go back to the market to revisit both, what their salary is going to be and where they want to play.
Yeah. I mean, I sports is always a microcosm of things that are that happen everywhere, and that, and I think this is just a perfect example of how law in particular often is at the kind of root level, the base level of something that people in society, they see sort of the top of the iceberg, but the bottom of the iceberg is some legal structure that's developed over years that is having this enormous influence on the little top of the iceberg that the public is seeing, right?
Exactly.
It's like the makeup of these teams and the way the players operate on the teams, the way that the players' health, like the way they train. I mean, all these things we've been talking about, the base layer there is something that has been worked out through law, really.
Yeah.
And then it has this effect on the sort of the product on the field. I mean, that's true in every business in our country is like that. There's sort of a root layer of law that has some very profound effect on the consumer experience that as the consumer you're not even really aware of.
Yeah.
I'm a lawyer and I read everything about these CBA agreements and it's just like Greek to me because it's very technical.
Yeah.
It's like, I'm not going to invest the time to go in and read the collective bargaining agreement from
they're hundreds of pages long.
Yeah, right. And I'm sure I would read it and still not totally understand it because I haven't been practicing, in that area of law all these years. And yet, like, the details of that agreement end up effectively deciding who's going to win the World Series the next year or something like that,
Yes.
Indirectly, right?
Yep, completely agree.
Yeah, it's kind of cool. So, I mean, this is the cool thing about being the sports lawyer, I guess you could say, if you were to put a positive spin on it. You say, like, the issues that the lawyers get involved in and have to resolve or fight over do actually end up having very large effects on the players and on the sport as a whole.
Right.
And, that can be both positive and negative for all these reasons. It's sort of like, the things that are good for the players might not be great for the game the way the fans think of it, right? Because again, from the fan perspective, you're not really that concerned about how the money is being distributed. You want to have a team to root for. That's the experience of being a fan, is rooting for the team, right? I mean, that is the fundamental thing that fans are willing to pay for. They want to have a team to root for, and some of these business concerns often kind of cut against that.
I think what's been heartening to me, I think over the last 10 or so years, is fans having much more recognition, and this fits within a variety of societal movements, of player empowerment, right? Like the right to control your employer. And, now with social media, obviously, people becoming brands unto themselves. And so I think people appreciate that, and people respect sometimes people standing up to their employer. So I think obviously you see probably a lot more people who are fans of players as opposed to teams these days. And you can certainly debate the pros and cons of that.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting stuff. All right. So let's hit a couple of these other issues. So Brian Flores versus the NFL.
Yeah.
All right. Give us the nutshell of what this case is about.
Yeah. So the NFL for a long time clearly has had a problem hiring and retaining minority coaches, particularly black men, as coaches. And so maybe 15 or so years ago, they came up with what's called the Rooney Rule. Art Rooney, a longtime family, owns the Pittsburgh Steelers, that initially just required that a minority candidate be interviewed as part of any head coaching search. The rule has expanded in a variety of ways to the front office, to now there being, draft pick compensation for hiring minority coaches. But nonetheless, none of these carrots have worked. And Brian Flores was a very successful defensive coach for the New England Patriots, who obviously win all the time, then became head coach of the Miami Dolphins, and spent 3 years there. And by all accounts, was making good progress, made the playoffs. The team, respected him, was fighting hard, and was very surprisingly fired at the end of the season. And shortly thereafter, he filed a class action discrimination lawsuit against the NFL and its 32 clubs, alleging obviously race discrimination. The lawsuit, there's a variety of issues related to it. One is that, and they're fighting over now, is whether the lawsuit is claims are subject to arbitration. All coaches, basically in all sports, in their contracts, say any dispute is subject to arbitration before the commissioner. I would suspect he will lose, and the claim will probably have to be arbitrated. There are legal challenges too in terms of being a class action, because this isn't like a bunch of people who bought a faulty can of soda or something. You can probably go out and find unfortunately, 20 or 30 coaches that this may have affected. He had some disputes with the Dolphins owner, Stephen Ross, about a couple of things. Most importantly, the NFL likes to put on a face about the importance of integrity and its stature, so to speak, in the American landscape. And Stephen Ross, the Dolphins owner, was accused by Flores of offering Flores a $100,000 bonus to intentionally lose games so the Dolphins would have a better draft pick. Nothing would be more violative of the NFL sort of integrity model than that. So this lawsuit,
you're supposed to lose games at the end of the season without being asked, right?
Yeah.
I mean, really, isn't it? I mean, the problem with that wasn't that the problem was that he was asked to do it and given and offered money. He should have known that it was his job to just do it.
I think there's different coaching philosophies around that. Some guys like to, you think, let's build some morale going into next season. Really.
Yeah. All right. That was just my commentary.
Yeah.
Strike that from the record.
Flores alleges that Ross had placed him in a position in which they would have been tampering with Tom Brady when he was under contract with, or when they weren't allowed to be speaking with him. And so, both those things are problematic for the Dolphins' perspective. But, Flores fortunately has subsequently been hired by the Steelers as a defensive coach. The Steelers, again, they're the impetus behind this rule, and they have as their coach Mike Tomlin, who's a black man and has been extremely successful in his approximately 15-year career. And so, that is heartwarming, so to speak, that he found a place to continue his career, because there was certainly a concern that he would be blackballed. Ultimately, proving the legal merits, will be challenging because you have to establish sort of, that this being a policy or practice, as opposed to just, bad conscious or unconscious bias and outcomes.
That's in any employment discrimination case, that is always the fight, right? I mean, just for any employee who's alleging discrimination on the basis of race or gender or something like that, the defense, if there is one, is always going to be no. We fired you for some other reason,
right?
But what's interesting about the case, it seems to me, is regardless of what you think about Flores, his position and why he was fired from the Dolphins, there's no question that race relations and professional sports intersect all the time. I mean, you just have to be blind to not see it, right? I mean, and each sport is a little different in this respect, but just the racial makeup of the players versus the coaches, the players versus the owners, is very stark in the NFL and the NBA, and then when you get into hockey and baseball, it's sort of like the opposite. It's like the players are not sort of particularly racially diverse, and maybe the reasons for that I'm guessing have not as much to do with the leagues themselves, but just with kind of societal things that are going on as people are growing up and where they're coming from, and all of that stuff. But there's no question that sports reflect racial issues in the bigger society, just like they reflect other things in the bigger society, and so to kind of boil it down to a sports law perspective, like in your time being a sports lawyer, have you encountered issues where kind of either at the front or maybe simmering in the back is something to do with race relations? I mean, how deep into that do the sports lawyers delve?
Well, so my background, fortunately, is, when I was at Harvard, dealt with a variety of other sort of sociological and different issues. And so I absolutely think you're right. I mean, the dynamics of when you have a stadium particularly in college football, of 100,000 people that may be 90% white and they're watching a field of majority black men, I think is problematic in certain ways. But in the NFL and in this situation, I don't know that I think the NFL is probably very similar to a lot of industries in which, so like what happens in coaching hiring is the GM, who's probably a white guy, he knows his buddies and they're well qualified, but they're also white guys that he connects with because maybe they're both from the same, community or have a similar background, or their dads did something similar, or they can picture having a beer with them, right? Like sort of the classic, sometimes interview type question. Well, maybe that black guy is just as qualified or even more qualified, but comes from somewhere else and maybe talks a little differently. And so you don't identify with him. You don't connect with him. And as a result, you don't consider him a serious candidate. And so I think that's what's happened in sports, just like it's happened in industries across this country.
Yeah. Yeah. And, the NFL, I think, is sort of of all the leagues is the place where it's been the most stark, because they've had some obviously very high controversial decisions that have been made over the years that seem to have racial overtones to them, right? Like from your perspective, is this a solvable issue, an issue where progress is being made, where it can be made? I mean, I think, like, again, going back to the Flores case, regardless of whether he wins or loses the case, it's kind of shining the light on this issue again.
So the NFL has not. They've asked the right consultants. There's a variety of sports law professors and experts, sociological experts. Like one guy I'm very friendly with, Jeremy Duru, who's a professor here at American University Washington College of Law, who's a black man and does labor and employment law, and he's consulted with the NFL, and so they are trying. But this speaks to some of my problem is. One of my least favorite parts of sports sometimes is you have people working in sports who only care about sports. And as a result, they're less sophisticated, less well-rounded, and less able to, be aware of their biases and different, things they should be thinking about. And so I think that's a hard thing to root out from sports, because you're always going to have quote unquote football guys who are just meat and potatoes, and I want to work 80 hours a week and play in the mud, and like, that's fun. I enjoy that too. But sports teams are major businesses that need a degree of sophistication. And so getting the right people in the building and getting that through is going to continue to be something of a challenge.
Yeah. And they tend to be businesses that are often dominated by like a small group of people.
Yeah.
Right. Like an owner. Like, I realize, like, all these teams, it's never really just an owner. There's always an ownership group.
Right.
Right. But there's often sort of one person or one family that seems from the outside to control. Like, here in DC, we talk about Dan Snyder owns the football team, whatever it's now called. And I'm sure he has a bunch of co-owners, but the perception is he's sort of really the one calling the shots. Right.
Yeah.
And so everything sort of comes down to one person or a small group of people. And that can, unlike, say, a publicly traded corporation, which maybe have some fluidity to its board or its CEOs or whatever, football teams don't seem to have that.
No, yeah.
And so it's sort of like, if that one person isn't kind of behind the effort, or if that one person kind of feeds that culture of, as you say, just meat and potatoes, play in the mud kind of mentality, it's hard to change it, maybe.
Yeah, part of the NFL's mystique, and they like, is that there used to be these families. The Hallis family owned the Bears, and the Mara family owned the Giants, and the Rooneys owned the Steelers, and they were these small local, club businesses. And well, it worked in the 20s and the 50s, but now you're multi-billion-dollar businesses. And the NFL still has a rule against public ownership. And so, yes, it is still very much intended to be a very private, closed doors organization, which as a result, there's not a lot of transparency or scrutiny, which results in problems like Dan Snyder running roughshod over, normal values.
Yeah. Yeah, right. And then again, I think it goes back to this like baseball card collecting mentality. It's sort of like, yeah, they could, right. Why doesn't the NFL just go public? If it was a normal business making as much money as they make,
right,
they would be traded on the New York Stock Exchange and the owners would trade their ownership for like, some huge payout.
Right.
But they don't, because they don't want to do that, right? They want to own the baseball card.
Yep.
They want to hold on to it for themselves. Well, that's interesting. All right. So, one more issue, one more sports issue, then we'll turn to American presidents. So college sports, the business of college sports, at least the perception is that has gone through a somewhat radical transformation recently. So give us the sports law perspective on that.
The issue at hand is name, image, and likeness, NIL. And starting this past year, academic year, college athletes were allowed to capitalize on that and sell their name, image, and likeness, their rights of publicity, just like anyone else can. They can have their face put on a soda, or a T-shirt and get $50 or $1,000 or whatever it is. Whether it's a radical transformation or not, I think remains to be seen. And I say that because the NCAA, like its professional counterparts, has argued for decades that if you were to ever let athletes have money or profit this way, you destroy the product. It wouldn't exist. And this is exactly what they argued in the Alston case that was decided by the Supreme Court, which antitrust law comes down to a reasonable analysis. And they were saying we need to constrain what is paid out to student athletes or players. In that case, was, to be clear, was only about academic related compensation, not sort of a free market, and actually not about NIL, which I know is confusing, but I'll sort of turn back to. But their argument was, look, if you let athletes receive amounts of money, the product as we know it ceases to exist. And the Supreme Court decided 9-0 against them. And of most interest to a lot of sports lawyers was Justice Kavanaugh wrote a concurring opinion by himself that just destroyed the NCAA. And he went through a variety of sort of interesting analogies that I think laid bare the hollowness of the NCAA's argument, saying, well, what if people like going to a restaurant where the waiters are just paid $1 an hour? Does that mean you've created a product that therefore should be exempt from antitrust law? No, you have to comply with the laws. And so saying the NCAA's argument was that people like going to college sports because college sports games because the athletes are not paid. And they could not find survey evidence to sufficiently back that up. And so we'll see in time whether the fact that athletes are able to receive compensation for the NIL actually has any change in fan interest. I think I'd be shocked if it does. I think most people at this point are quite accepting of why can't these individuals make a little bit of money off of their fame, because it is very fleeting.
And it's a small number of players that are really going to be able to do that, right?
Yeah.
The vast majority of college athletes,
right.
There's no real value there.
They might get like a free pizza or something, but they're only at the very high end. And fortunately, there's been, I think the data is still being shook out, but there's been some high profile women basketball players that are receiving, $1 million contracts and things like that. And so, I don't think anyone, well, I shouldn't say anyone, but by and large, it's more power to them. They're not doing, tobacco ads or anything, but why can't they, have a shoe deal?
Yeah. And the college athletes are still not being paid by the colleges.
Exactly.
I mean, beyond scholarships.
Yeah. And that's what the Alston case was about, that they said the NCAA could no longer restrict academic benefits to student athletes. Mm-hmm. So schools can now offer as an inducement, hey, if you come play for us, we'll pay for your graduate school, so to speak, or we'll pay for you to go abroad. Mm-hmm. That market has not quite opened up yet, but that is now the sort of law.
But what prevents a school from just literally paying? Is there anything in the legal system that prevents, let's say, some college that doesn't have a good football team but wants one?
Yeah.
Why can't they just go out and offer, and call it what you will, call it a scholarship, whatever you will, but basically just offer more money?
So the NCAA rules still prohibit compensation unrelated to academics. And courts thus far have determined that is reasonable. Mm-hmm. And the plaintiff's attorneys chose not to challenge that at the Supreme Court. They wanted to sort of view this incrementally. Let's win something. Let's leave the bigger issue for later. And so currently rules still prohibit that. But that's where gray areas start to happen with NIL and academic benefits. When do things cross the line between in the NIL space, like, is the school helping?
Yeah, I was going to say, so if you're, let's say you're a star football player at a big, a D1 school, and you now in theory control your NIL rights.
Yeah.
Can you sell those rights back to your school and say, I'll give you the right to print T-shirts with my picture on it? And can the schools just pay them that way? Or is that still out? Would that still violate the NCAA rules?
It's interesting because, like in the major sports leagues, athletes control the rights to publicity, and they enter into what are called group licensing agreements. And they do, in some of the leagues, sell those rights back to the leagues. And so generally, like when sports leagues use player images or team sponsors, they have to have like 4 or 5 of them. So it's not viewed as an individual endorsement. That leaves the player himself free to go off and do an individual endorsement and capitalize that on his own. I think that college is probably something similar. I'm not positive, but I would imagine somewhere in the scholarship relationship, the school retains certain rights to use the athlete's name and image to promote the school and the team, so to speak. But the player can still often go and do his own thing.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I always think about just, like you go to any sports team, right? You can go in and you can buy a jersey with the name of a player on the background. And I've always assumed the players must get something out of that.
They were not historically. And that was like a problem.
Yeah.
I honestly don't know how that's, then schools went to a period of like, all right, no names. Yeah. And so I think the market is still like shaking out on that.
Yeah. Well, and so, I mean, if you had to predict like what's going to come over the next 5 or 10 years, do you think we will get to a point where colleges will just start paying?
So the major advent, the last 2 years, somewhere around 30 states have passed legislation that specifically allowed athletes to capitalize on NIL. Then the NCAA repealed. The NCAA at first opposed those laws. Then there was a flood of them and they couldn't compete. And so they repealed their law for all these different legal reasons. And now states are repealing their laws because their laws are being considered too restrictive in the market. Some states had laws requiring athletes to like register or make certain people aware. And some high schoolers can say, well, I don't want to go to that state that, they have restrictive NIL laws. I want to go to a state where there are no laws. I can do whatever I want. The NCAA has now, guidelines in terms of what's appropriate, but those have not been litigated or adjudicated in any way. Some body of case law is going to have to develop on that to sort of set some boundaries in terms of what's reasonable. The NCAA keeps talking about like federal legislation and antitrust exemptions. I don't frankly see that happening. So, I don't think that I don't view schools paying players outright as eminent. I think courts will still find that to be a reasonable restraint.
Yeah. I mean, the one place where you could see the challenge coming would be in D1 football, right?
Yeah.
Because that's probably the one place where one sort of reasonable way to characterize what is happening, at least, is that you have a university that has a business relationship with what is effectively a professional sports team that plays in its stadium, right?
Yeah.
And sort of nominally on paper, those players are also students of the university, but that doesn't really matter that much.
Yeah.
And the coaches get paid more than the college presidents. And they generate huge funds, and so why not just turn the SEC into a professional football league, and the teams can have affiliation agreements with the universities where the University of Alabama can license its name to a team that plays in Alabama for the SEC league.
Yeah. That
will then pay the University of Alabama some money for that right.
Yeah.
I mean, because effectively, isn't that what is happening in those leagues?
So 2 things there. One, there is continued discussion of sort of those major conferences, and they're now called the Power 5, and they have increased autonomy to do certain things. So there is continued discussion sort of around that. Adjacent to this litigation I've mentioned, there is ongoing litigation as to whether student athletes are employees. And I think they've gotten some traction, and then there are potential unionization efforts. So I could see in a handful of years courts finding that they are employees, and therefore then they're subject to minimum wage laws and wage and hour laws, overtime. And that could have a dramatic impact.
Yeah. And again, there's just sort of the look and feel of it when you've got the coach on the sidelines who's getting paid multiple millions of dollars. And there's, the school is making huge amounts of money off the naming rights and all the publicity and the TV contracts, and the players are getting what? They're getting a scholarship to go to a school that isn't even really that serious about educating them. And it just, like if you can just step away from the fiction that they're amateur athletes for a minute, like, and the schools themselves have created this situation. I mean, there probably was a time going back in time where the football teams were not the major source of revenue for big colleges, and where the coaches didn't make more than the professors, but the schools have created that situation now where it's just sort of become, and again, we're talking about a small number of D1 football conferences mostly. I think in the others, even in basketball, it's not quite as bad. Other sports, not at all, really. So we're really just talking about D1 football primarily, but there, it just seems that the disparity and the economics of it, it's just so patently obvious. Like you can no longer with a straight face say that SEC football is just a bunch of college kids, rah, 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 let's go beat, the other college down the road. That's not what's happening.
And I think the hope is by now allowing players to receive income on their own, you're letting a little bit of the steam out of that situation. And we'll see in time whether that's sort of enough or what other rights they sort of, obtain.
All right. Well, a very interesting conversation, and thank you so much for educating us about all those issues. And hey, it does seem to me that being a sports lawyer is actually kind of fun and interesting. I mean, there's just a lot of just such a broad variety of legal issues you get to tackle, and there is something kind of fun and cool about being kind of backstage to the big show, and that's really what it is, right?
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, it's always fun to read things in the news that like you're involved with, and what's actually going on, and knowing lots of people care about it, and so yes, for sure, there's a sexiness there.
Yeah, and all sorts of, and also just it intersects with a lot of really interesting legal issues and societal issues, and it's a fun practice. All right, so if any of you are listening and thinking of becoming sports lawyers, or if you're in the sports world and need a lawyer, you now know who to call. Call Chris. And in the show notes to the podcast, we'll put links to Chris's web bio so you can find him online. Do you do like Twitter or any other place where you'd like to tell people to find you?
On LinkedIn, I post a lot of content, which I think people find substantive and useful. So feel free to find me there. Okay, great. All right. So now we're going to move away from the law talk and into something that's sort of law adjacent, which is U.S. politics. So Chris told me that he is not only a sports fan, but a fan of U.S. presidential history. Maybe we should just start out by explaining to the listeners what it is that you're trying to do. Like, what is your goal? You have set yourself a goal. What is that goal? It's to read a biography of every American president, and so far I'm through FDR, our 32nd president. And so you are reading them in chronological order. It didn't start that way, but at some point I did restart that way, yes. And why did you pick that as a particular goal? I think I was thinking about this on the way over. Some years ago, I saw a documentary by the brilliant filmmaker Ken Burns about the Roosevelt family, Teddy, Franklin, and Eleanor. And I was aware of, at the time, Doris Kearns Goodwin, a prominent historian, had written the book Bully Pulpit about Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. And so I read that book, and I think sort of went from there. What is it about the American presidents? I mean, you could have been like, let's read a biography of everybody in the Hall of Fame. Yeah. Like something sports adjacent. But you picked American presidents. Like what is it that you think makes that a particularly interesting topic for you? It's a good question. And I think this speaks to a lot. I read other biographies too. and I think about sometimes whether that's overdone. And that gets into, actually, when I was at Harvard, I had the chance to like take classes there. I remember I took a class on like leadership. And there's different theories of leadership, and one is just sort of like the great man theory or great person theory. And so I may be, unfortunately, prone to that a little bit, like looking for these great people and things to learn from them. And so, drawn to that in terms of like Washington or Lincoln or something. But then just having an interest in the history of America and American law and the Constitution. And I figured, the presidents was a good linear way to begin to understand that whole history.
All right. So you're through the first 32.
Yeah.
Who's your favorite so far? Now that you know a little bit about each of their histories, you've read up on their life story. Was there one that sort of surprised you? You were like, wow, that guy, because it's always a guy, that guy that story was really interesting, and I now feel great admiration for him.
I'll give an obvious answer, and
let's leave Washington and Lincoln off, because they're too easy.
Yeah, I love Washington, Lincoln, and Teddy Roosevelt, but I have a soft spot for certain presidents that I think were better people than presidents. And there's two in particular I identify, Rutherford B. Hayes and then William Howard Taft.
Okay, so you got to start by even telling, because these are not people that we study a lot in school. So Hayes and who?
William Howard Taft.
Okay, Hayes and Taft. All right, so roughly when was Hayes the president?
Hayes was president from 77 to 81. 1877 to 1881. Yeah.
Right. Okay. And so what was it about him that you found interesting?
Both these guys are from Ohio, but Hayes had been an Ohio lawyer. Obviously, I don't remember his full background, but a degree of self-made. But then the Civil War had remarkable service. Was injured, obviously on behalf of the Union side. Injured numerous times, shot many times, and like 3 or 4 times, and recovered and went back. And so uses that as a launching pad to a successful political career thereafter. What's interesting about Hayes gets criticized because he's perceived in 1876, when there was a dispute about the Electoral College, of agreeing to sort of end Reconstruction in the South in exchange for the South not challenging his election to the presidency. I think that's a little unfair, because by that time the North had basically given up on trying to impose Reconstruction on the South. But so his presidency is not anything to write home about. It's not terribly important historically. He's one of only 2 presidents to have a full first term and voluntarily not choose to run for a second term.
Who's the other one?
Polk being the other one.
Okay.
Polk died within months of leaving office, but Hayes lived for many years after and spent the rest of his career promoting a variety of social issues. Was at that time advanced in terms of racial equality and promoted racial equality. Was big into promoting education for women and really everyone. And so by today's standards was a very soft-hearted liberal. Yeah. And so his presidency, at that time, there was, particularly post-Lincoln, was a lot of debates about the strength of the executive. And so he was a meek president, as many were around that time, didn't, sort of took his cues from Congress. And so his presidency is not great. But I think he was a very good person.
Yeah. And was that sort of personhood tied in some way, if you remember, to his decision not to run a second time?
So this is a theme that William Henry Harrison was the first to say, I won't run for a second term, which didn't matter because he died 41 days into his presidency. But, in the 1800s, by and large, presidents assumed that the Congress, as Article 1 of the Constitution was preeminent, and I will not try and be a king, so to speak. So in some respects that humility is respectable, but you've now done a disservice to your legacy by not being sort of more authoritative. I'm going to be president for 8 years and I'm going to lead. Yeah.
It's interesting because in modern politics, it's almost hard to imagine a president that wouldn't run for a second term. I mean, we had to change the Constitution to stop them from just running forever.
Right. Right.
So as FDR did. And so that is interesting. Okay, so and then Taft was your other favorite. So why?
Taft grew up in a prominent family in Ohio. Again, this maybe I'm not even from the Midwest, but like there's a lot of Ohio presidents, and a lot of them have this Midwestern geniality.
Yeah.
And Taft grew up in a family, I think, of lawyers, and he really, among many, I think what I've read, like was the least interested in being president. He wanted to be a judge. Like that was his main goal, and he eventually becomes a Supreme Court justice. But he is a successful lawyer in Ohio. Eventually gets drafted into sort of the federal government and serves under Teddy, and he's oversees the Philippines after we sort of occupy that after the Spanish-American War, and has also like an unremarkable presidency in which he's a Republican Party. He takes his cues from Congress again, very similar. And I don't think he enjoyed it. He didn't have like the ego to like, no, you listen to me. And as a result, didn't achieve a whole lot. And then I think happily sort of retired and then became Chief Justice, which was his dream job at the Supreme Court. So in that sense, like, a humble, likable guy who just really wanted to be a good lawyer or judge.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it's a little hard to imagine somebody like that running today, right?
Yeah, he wouldn't have had the personality for it.
Did you get some sense from reading those biographies of sort of what presidential campaigns were like in, say, like the late 1800s? I mean, obviously before radio, before TV, before the internet. I mean, you see these pictures of the candidates on a train, right?
Yeah.
They would just get on a train, and the train would stop at every town, and they'd step out onto the platform and give a speech or whatever, and then get back on the train and go to the next town. Like what is your sense from reading those biographies of what it meant to run for president back then?
Yeah. So it's interesting because there's an evolving standard in terms of what's acceptable and decorum. And so even like McKinley, when he ran for president in 1896, he didn't even leave. He just stayed on his porch and people came to him. And he thought like, well, my position's strong enough. Like I don't have to go out there and like risk my position. I think, it even like today, every year it's like, well, that used to be unacceptable, but like now everyone's doing it, right. Like, with super PAC money or something.
Yeah.
One thing I think about is people complain about the media a lot today in terms of what's true or untrue, and some of that's justified, some of it's not. But in the 1800s, and even in Washington's second term, reporters just made stuff up, like terrible, horrible things about candidates that like was clearly slanderous and wouldn't survive any First Amendment standard today. And so I'd like to think our standards have actually evolved a little bit.
Oh yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. We sort of assume that things are really bad now, but maybe in fact they've just always been bad in politics. Yeah. Every generation thinks their politics are the worst they've ever been.
Right.
So all right, I'll ask one more. I mean, we could talk about this forever, but we've been chatting for a long time, and you've been very generous with your time. So let me just ask one more question. So you've read about 32 presidents so far. Is there some sort of unifying theme themes that you can see that led this group of people in particular to rise to that position?
So for better or worse, the people we remember are the people, and the people considered the greatest presidents are the people who stretched the bounds of executive authority. There were gaps to fill in between the legislative and executive branch, or even the judiciary. And the quote unquote great presidents are the ones that said, well, I'm just going to assert this authority and we'll see what you do about it. I mean, FDR and Lincoln and certainly did that. And George Washington was very mindful from the beginning of like, I understand this is an important precedent. I want to be very careful about this. But like Andrew Jackson did that. And I tend to think he's actually a terrible president in person for a variety of reasons. But those are the ones, and even Polk had what's considered a successful president who's not well known. But again, often there's wars. Like there's a war, and president says, "Well, I'm just taking this white space, and we'll see if anyone challenges me." And if the Congress is under his control, they might not. And then all of a sudden, that's an accepted norm from presidential behavior.
Yeah. And that tends to be historically a little bit of a ratchet that's hard to pull back.
Exactly, very much.
We have this sort of we have a very powerful executive branch now.
Yeah.
The president has a lot of authority, not unlimited. I mean, he still has to get things through Congress, but in a lot of spheres, the president has enormous power, and it hasn't always been that way. Like that has slowly ratcheted up over time. And we'll see if that continues. Well, that's very interesting. Well, now you've kind of made me want to go back and read some biographies. I'm personally not a big biography reader, but it is an interesting way to kind of get inside of history, like through somebody's personal story, right?
Yeah.
All right. Well, this has been a really, really fun conversation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Garrulous Gavel. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. You can always find us at garrulousgavel.com. If you'd like to send feedback or suggest a guest, please contact us at our email address, garrulousgavel@gmail.com, or on Twitter at garrulousgavel. Our cover art was created by artist and illustrator extraordinaire Joan Tico. Our theme music was written and performed by scientist and saxophonist extraordinaire Robert Tico. And our producer is the inimitable K.O. Myers of Particulate Media. See you next episode.